I have a history with Final Fantasy VI. I think about it an unhealthy amount. It was the first game that really taught me that games could make me feel emotions. I know more about it than any other game. Upon replaying it in another language that I'm not as familiar with as English, I was still able to tell what every character was saying simply because I know most of the game by heart. It helped me learn that language more just because I could reverse translate a lot of the dialogue. It is without a doubt my favorite game of all time. That doesn't mean I don't have problems with it. Far from it. The gameplay balance is too easy, the plot is often really unfocused, and a lot of the characters don't do a whole lot. None of these make it a bad game, but because I'm so entwined with it, Final Fantasy VI is a game whose flaws are incredibly familiar to me. I replay it near yearly and encounter them once again. The most glaring of these flaws is one that you're probably very familiar with yourself if you've ever tried to play the game. The fact that no true definitive version of it exists for new players to get into. Nearly every other Final Fantasy game, at least out of the ones I've played, has a definitive version. 1 and 2 are both on the PSP with rich graphics. 3's DS version is stellar in that it almost makes you care about Final Fantasy III. I said almost. 4 has 2 definitive versions, the PSP version, which has gorgeous sprite work, and the DS version, which enriches the narrative. Either one is great. 5 unfortunately runs into the same problem as 6. 7 is the PC version for the wide breadth of mods you can get for it, as is 9. 13 and 14 only have one release each. I haven't played the other games in the series, but they all seem to have best versions as well. Which is why when the Pixel remasters of the Final Fantasy games were announced, I was excited. I assumed that there was going to be a definitive version of Final Fantasy VI finally on the market. I was wrong. Very wrong. The Pixel remasters aren't terrible ways to play the games, but they're certainly not the best. This leaves Final Fantasy VI in the same position we left it in, without a proper definitive version. So today I'm going to be looking at every port of Final Fantasy VI, and then discussing why I think each one doesn't stack up to the original release at all. First, let's look into the initial port, and the worst one. In the late 90s, Square was sort of on a quest to make the PlayStation the ultimate Final Fantasy machine. Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, and Tactics were all on the system, and Final Fantasy 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 were all ported to it. There's something notable about these ports, however. They're pretty much the worst way to play all of these games, besides maybe Final Fantasy 2. Final Fantasy 6's PS1 re-release is no different. It's horrible. The game takes a long time to load even opening and closing the menu. There are a few added features, such as some new FMVs that were probably never seen again, and the first version of the bestiary that has persisted in every other re-release for reasons I don't quite comprehend. Even an early version of the quick save feature, which is one of the most underrated features in video games, is present here. For the most part though, it's just Final Fantasy VI for the SNES, but with absolutely abysmal load times. It's really not worth playing. Next on the chopping block is the one that most people probably think is the best way to play Final Fantasy VI. This is the Game Boy Advance version of the game, aptly titled Final Fantasy VI Advance, which followed ports of every Final Fantasy game before it besides 3 again, for some reason, to the GBA. This version of Final Fantasy VI has a huge slew of changes compared to the PS1 version. In terms of just the main menu, the bestiary is back, and there's a music player which is hugely appreciated due to the game's amazing soundtrack. Here's where the first issue comes in though. The GBA doesn't have a dedicated sound processor like the SNES does, so the music took a significant hit when it was ported to the GBA version. It's incredibly unfortunate that my favorite game soundtrack of all time was butchered like this. Another thing took a hit too, the graphics. Everything has been substantially brightened to fit the GBA's weird lighting better. The darker atmosphere of Final Fantasy VI is really hampered by this release's overly saturated color scheme, and I don't like it. However, that doesn't mean that this version is without its improvements. After all, there's a reason why this version is called the best one. For starters, there are a lot of new magicite and 2 new dungeons added to the game. Your mileage may vary on this though. I find that the new content doesn't really add much to the game as a whole. It's great to keep playing around in the world of Final Fantasy VI, but it feels so tedious and ends up not feeling substantial in any shape or form. The other big draw people often talk about is the new translation. A lot of people praise it for being more accurate to the source material, but honestly I thought the old translation was fine enough too. The new one isn't terrible either, I just don't really think it's as drastic an improvement over the original work as other people do. Next is the most infamous version of the game, the original mobile port from 2013, which takes cues from its contemporary Final Fantasy V mobile port. This is just a new version of the GBA port, though the music has been completely restored. What has attempted to be restored are the graphics. We got this blurry mess. There's a lot to unpack with these, but frankly the sprites themselves don't look horrible on their own. It's when they're put into the game and these weird, gross bilinear filters are applied to them that things go south. What are bilinear filters even for? They never look good. And again, it's all just too saturated for my liking. Final Fantasy VI is a dark game by its nature, and to see everyone look so bright and babyish in design just doesn't feel right. Also, the menus just suck. That last part is a common trend in Square Enix ports. Now, let's talk about the latest re-release of Final Fantasy VI, the Pixel Remaster, which was the last to release in the Remastered Collection. And I say the word remaster very lightly. This is not really a remaster. The new character sprite look looks good. I don't really know what the problem there is. Same with the battle backgrounds. However, that's where my praise for the visuals ends. Everything else clashes ridiculously. All the enemy sprites are taken directly from the SNES original, all the overworld tiles are from the GBA version, and the font is just nightmarishly ugly and tiny. For some reason the water is all shaded now, like Octopath Traveler or something. Blitzes are now just fed to you as you use them, removing the entire point of memorizing them like fighting game combos. Science Bushido no longer totally sucks, which is actually a welcome change. Aside from that though, there's very little change about the gameplay itself, which is probably one of the things that Final Fantasy VI needed the most. Everything that's been added just makes the game easier, like random tent drops on the Phantom Train or secret passages showing you where they are. Yes, really, Final Fantasy VI is not a game that needs a difficulty decrease. It's way too easy already. There is one change in this remaster I quite like though. Nobuo Uematsu redid the entire soundtrack for this game, and it's otherworldly how good it is. I adore it. But other than that, there's nothing really to talk about here. I'm not sure who this remaster is even for. People who just want a faithful experience to the original release will find it weirdly ugly, and people like me who want it radically changed will find that it doesn't want to do anything interesting with the things it does change. The new sprites, while good, just look like different versions of the old one, and that's not interesting at all. Final Fantasy VI is my favorite game of all time. Despite the ups and downs I've had with it, that has been true since I was 12 years old. Unfortunately, there is no right way to play through the game. Every version has major caveats. That's why I have to recommend the SNES original. Nothing is gained, but nothing is lost either. It's just good old Final Fantasy VI. If you really care about the translation, there are patches for the SNES version that adjust as be the GBA version's translation, though I see no issue with playing through the original one either. Just whatever you do, don't play the PS1 version. It's not worth the pain. This has been Arcade Everlasting, someone who doesn't understand why Square Enix can't get a simple re-release of my favorite game of all time right, signing off. Thank you for watching.